Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 7 wide receiver rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things wide receiver related, starting off with some news around the National Football League. Then we'll go into the wide receiver matchups going into Week 7, which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season in a half PPR scoring format, which matchups we want to take advantage of, and which matchups we might want to avoid going into Week 7. Then after that, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, again at a half PPR sense. For those of you who are looking for specific players, you can go down in the description of the video and find the timestamps down there. Outside of that, if you want to continue to support the channel, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Again, we just recently hit 31,000. I can't thank you guys enough. We're on our way to 32,000. I mean, your guys' support has been incredible. Again, we're going to be making fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the season. Tomorrow, we'll talk about tight ends and quarterbacks. The following week, they hit in gems. Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, we'll have our Kickoff with Kiorkof live stream, just kind of getting everybody's lineups ready to go. Outside of that, again, make sure you click the like button down below. It really does help me out a lot. Trying to get past 1,000 likes every video, that would be much appreciated. And that's pretty much it. So again, let's get into it, shall we? So on today's episode, I wanted to first and foremost start talking about some news around the National Football League. There's been a couple rumors that have been thrown around in the last couple hours about Antonio Brown having already served his 8-game suspension in the next couple weeks, coming back and potentially being picked up by a contender. Now, the Seattle Seahawks has been thrown around here and there. Of course, prior to the season beginning, we saw Russell Wilson and Antonio Brown working out privately in one-on-one sessions. So again, there's always a possibility that he could be picked up. He's a guy in fantasy that is probably going to be widely available. Majority of leagues probably aren't even looking at him. He's not on anybody's radar. So I just wanted to throw him out. If in fact these rumors are to be true, if in fact there is interest from the Seahawks and Antonio Brown, and that relationship is kind of kindled itself into a situation where it might actually happen, then of course Antonio Brown would have immense value in fantasy, especially with how good Russell Wilson's been this year, and how great the wide receiver core of DK Metcalf on the other side and Tyler Lockett have been. That trio would be incredible. But of course, as of right now, it's just a rumor. Just keep an eye on it. That's all I'm saying. Outside of that, let's go ahead and that's pretty much all the news I wanted to pretty much mention. Let's talk about some wide receivers and the matchups going into Week 7 like we usually do on a weekly basis. So, as you can see on screen, the Seattle Seahawks, who we were just talking about, they are horrible on defense. Their secondary has been struggling heavily. They give up so many points to opposing wide receivers. In fact, they give up almost 17 points more than any other team in the National Football League right now in fantasy football. So, again, you want to always take advantage of this matchup. The Seattle Seahawks, even though they were on bye week last week, this upcoming week, they've got a tough matchup. DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk, those are two great wide receivers that could take advantage of said matchup. Let's not forget this upcoming week, we have the Indianapolis Colts, the Baltimore Ravens, the Minnesota Vikings, the Miami Dolphins all on bye week, so we won't be able to take care of those matchups and find any value there. But again, Seattle Seahawks, the Dallas Cowboys, of course, have been struggling in the secondary. The Cleveland Browns, they've been beat up there. I mean, both of their starting safeties were out this past week. Of course, Ben Roethlisberger was able to torch them with the likes of James Washington for majority of that game. Of course, Minnesota's on a bye. The Las Vegas Raiders have to take on the dynamic duo of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. That's going to be difficult for them. The Steelers, they have themselves, pretty full hands against A.J. Brown, a returning Corey Davis, and Adam Humphries. But either way, these are the easiest matchups at the wide receiver position going into Week 7 to kind of give you guys a little bit of extra perspective. I also wanted to mention some of the tougher matchups. Now, of course, the Chicago Bears and the Los Angeles Rams, they both play against one another, and both of them should be, I think this is going to be a relatively lower scoring game between the two. Even though both these teams have played each other in the past 2 seasons, you go back and you look at the scores between them. The Rams just recently this past season won 17-7, and then the year prior they lost 6-15. So they've always had lower scoring matchups between the Chicago Bears and the Rams, mainly because Jared Goff doesn't play well. So that doesn't really bode well for the wide receiver core. On the other side, Nick Foles, even though he has proven to be the starting quarterback for the Chicago Bears, it really hasn't clicked without outside of, Allen Robinson, there's just not really anybody there stepping up, making plays, unfortunately. So the wide receiver position there outside Allen Robinson just kind of bare bones. Of course, the Washington football team, they've been playing out of their mind in the secondary, a lot more improved than seasons prior, to say the very least, with, of course, a defensive-minded head coach kind of changing the culture there. The Arizona Cardinals playing against Seahawks, I'm not really worried about that. The Carolina Panthers, they're not giving up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. But again, I'm sure this week's Michael Thomas is going to be able to take care of the matchup. Of course, that's why he's on the thumbnail. Anyway, so we can go ahead and move on We could begin by talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 7 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Starting off with my number 1, it really shouldn't be a surprise. He's been the number 1 for the last couple weeks in a row. It is DeAndre Hopkins. Again, DeAndre Hopkins, even though this past week only had 2 receptions for 73 yards, he didn't even play for a majority of that second half because they didn't have to even play him. I mean, let's be honest. After you're up 21-3 at halftime, then you take an even bigger lead. You get into the 30-point lead range. It's not a game anymore. And at that point, DeAndre Hopkins, why not just save him, keep him rested, and get him ready for a divisional matchup against the Seahawks, in which he's going to have to ball out in order to keep up with the likes of Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf. So either way, I think DeAndre Hopkins has been a fantastic wide receiver as of right now, leads the NFL in receiving yards. Just looking at what Seattle has given up to opposing wide receivers as of late, I'm just going to read a couple receiving yard counts from the opposing wide receivers that have faced the Seahawks this season. 157, 130, 114, 179, 138, 107, and 110. There's a couple 80s and 86s in there that I didn't mention, but now I have. They just give up all the yards. It doesn't matter who they play. All the yards are given up to Seattle. So I expect, of course, DeAndre Hopkins to sustain as the number 1 wide receiver this week and have himself a fantastic performance. Our number 2 this week is Michael Thomas. Welcome back. I expect Michael Thomas to absolutely play because the organization has said so themselves. They're not going to punish him. He should be ready to go. Of course, he's been dealing with that high ankle sprain for the last couple weeks, and had that suspension in week 5. But again, let's not forget what Michael Thomas is capable of. I mean, prior to the 2020 season and prior to that ankle injury, in 2019, he was the best wide receiver. He broke the record for the most receptions in a single season. He had an incredible amount of targets and target share within his own respective offense. And the last time he played against the Carolina Panthers, he had 11 targets, 10 receptions for 101 yards and a touchdown. So let's not forget who Michael Thomas is. Carolina, even though they're not giving up that many points to opposing wide receivers, they've had their fair share of damage done to them. In the last couple of weeks, 104, 132, and 136, given up to 3 respective teams in their number 1 wide receivers. So again, Michael Thomas, another one of these studs. If Emmanuel Sanders is going to get double-digit targets, imagine what Michael Thomas gets when he returns. It's going to be an exciting thing to see. All right, another one of these wide receivers that's healthy and ready to go, Davante Adams. Now, even though the script of the game for the Green Bay Packers against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wasn't great, Aaron Rodgers was under so much pressure that he really couldn't even get the ball out of his hands for a majority of the time. Davante Adams still was decent. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 61 yards. We'd like to see, probably better numbers from him, especially against the Tampa Bay secondary, but he has the opportunity this upcoming week against the Houston secondary to have a pretty good game. I mean, let's not forget last week, A.J. Brown, Adam Humphries, both of them scored a touchdown. A.J. Brown even had 2. In the last 2 weeks, the Houston Texans have given up 5 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. So again, we remember Davante Adams for being this touchdown monster, being a red zone threat. They're going to get back to doing that. Of course, the Green Bay Packers aren't happy with their performance, and I think they'll get back on track this upcoming week against Houston as Davante Adams leads the pack, of course, with Aaron Jones. We go to move on to our number 4. We have ourselves Julio Jones. Man, it feels good to actually have the legitimate top wide receivers back at the top of the list. There's no more injuries plaguing these guys. It's really exciting to see now that we're almost getting to the midpoint way of the season. We get our guys back and they can actually help us win. And that's what Julio did for many of our lineups this past week. 10 targets, 8 receptions for $137 and 2 touchdowns, 29.7 fantasy points. I mean, that is the kind of production we expect to see from Julio Jones on a weekly basis. There's a reason why he's one of the best, wide receivers in the National Football League. But either way, the fact that Calvin Ridley's been balling out on the other side of the field just only helps him going forward. The fact that this team has a little bit of life kind of injected in them with a little bit of the change of the culture in terms of the head coach and all that kind of stuff. It's nice to see. The Detroit Lions, they've been banged up at cornerback all season long. Even with a healthy secondary this upcoming week, I don't really expect to see Detroit as a imposing threat. I mean, just look at what Keelan Cole was able to do against them last week. Even DJ Chark had 14 targets, but he only caught 7 of the passes. Imagine if he catches 3 or 4 more of those passes. We have ourselves another one, 200-yard games against this Detroit secondary. So I think Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, they'll be able to take care of it and have themselves a pretty good week here in week 7. Moving on, we have ourselves number 5, DK Metcalf, of course, playing against the Arizona Cardinals. Might not be the easiest task on hand with Budda Baker back and, of course, Drake Kirkpatrick, pass interference. But it's going to be probably Patrick Peterson. It doesn't really matter. The whole point is, what can we expect to see from DK Metcalf? Of course, we didn't have him in week 6. We haven't seen him since week 5. But thus far this season, DK Metcalf has been averaging 17 fantasy points a game and a half PPR scoring format. He scored 5 touchdowns in the first 5 games of the season and has been I guess I would say unstoppable to an extent. Sure, he's only catching the ball 4 to 6 times a game, but as long as he's getting these deep ball opportunities, these red zone threats, these end zone targets, DK Metcalf's going to consistently be a viable threat and a 20-point play potential every single week. The fact that he's been averaging 17 points is a beautiful thing. Again, 5 touchdowns in 5 weeks. You don't really see that often. And I think as long as this team is going to continue to rely upon Russell Wilson to air it out a little bit, DK Metcalf is going to be benefiting from it. We have Tyreek Hill at number 6. They play against the Denver Broncos. We know Denver's secondary has not been great this year. My only concern for this game and my only hesitation is the fact that it could be snowing in this game against Denver. That being said, the last time the Kansas City Chiefs and the Denver Broncos played in a snow game, it was last season, week 15. Tyreek Hill, 5 catches, 67 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns in that game against Denver. So Tyreek Hill, Patrick Mahomes, the snow doesn't really bother them anyway. So they should be pretty good to go. I know Tyreek Hill had a little bit of a down week this past week on Monday Night Football, but it was more of a game script plan where, hey, you know what? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let Clyde Edwards, pretty much kill out the clock and run the rock. So Tyreek Hill just kind of played the third or fiddle to this offense behind Travis Kelce and, of course, Clyde Edwards. And they got the job done. But again, I expect Tyreek Hill to bounce back this upcoming week as my number 6 wide receiver. We move on to number 7, Calvin Ridley, of course, one of the best wide receivers. In fact, as of right now, as of this moment in time, he's the number 1 wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, only ahead of Adam Thielen just slightly. And Adam Thielen has 7 touchdowns. So for those of you who are going to be missing Adam Thielen this week, you're definitely going to be missing him because that's a lot of influx of points. But regardless, Calvin Ridley with Julio Jones back is even that much more of a threat in my eyes. Being able to have the number 1 cornerback on the opposite side of the field pulling coverage and you playing against the second best corner every week, that in itself gives Calvin Ridley that much more value. This past week, 6 catches for 61 and a touchdown against the Minnesota Vikings, plays against Detroit again. I think this offense has kind of turned over a new leaf here. I'm hoping that's the case. I'm hoping they are going to see more shootouts as the weeks progress. Hopefully this offense doesn't look like what they did in those 2 weeks where Matt Ryan wasn't throwing touchdowns. I expect them to get past that and continue to ball out, and Calvin Ridley should be fantastic as my number 7. The next player on our list is Kenny Golladay as my number 8. And we just talked about 2 wide receivers for the Atlanta Falcons. On the opposite side of that matchup, we have ourselves the Detroit Lions and, of course, Kenny Golladay. This past week against Jacksonville, had himself 4 catches for 104 receiving yards. It's a great game. Of course, I'd like to have that accompanied by a touchdown here and there for some more upside. But again, Kenny Golladay is capable of that. And I think against Atlanta this upcoming week, has himself a really good chance of doing so. I mean, just looking at what Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson did in the second half against the Atlanta Falcons, that secondary, regardless of whether they're healthy or not, is definitely a bare bones group of players. They are not at the talent level to be able to stop top tier wide receiver talent. And with Kenny Golladay coming to town, I think there's a very good chance that Kenny Golladay could continue on his streak, keep up with this 100 yards, get himself a touchdown, and be an extremely viable asset in fantasy. So, of course, we're starting him up. Kenny Golladay as my number 8. We have ourselves number 9 here, A.J. Brown. Since coming back from his bone bruise, A.J. Brown has been incredible. I mean, sure, this upcoming week, they play against the Pittsburgh Steelers. In my opinion, the Pittsburgh Steelers aren't the greatest, pass-stopping defense. Of course, they could stop the run, but in terms of coverage, they're not one of the best in the National Football League. So that gives a lot of an advantage to Ryan Tannehill in this passing attack. They get Corey Davis back. They have Adam Humphries firing it off in the slot position. And, of course, you have A.J. Brown dominating number 1 cornerbacks. This just past week, he had himself 2 receiving touchdowns, 5 catches, 56 yards. We expect that kind of production from A.J. Brown. That's where he left off in 2019. That's where he's going to pick up in 2020. I think even though Pittsburgh could give them troubles because, their offensive line is a little banged up in Tennessee, I still do expect them to try to get as many opportunities in the direction of A.J. Brown and let him feast, because running the ball might not be an option this week for Derrick Henry. It could be a pretty tough task at hand. So, of course, they're going to have to lean upon studs like A.J. Brown. Moving on to number 10, we have ourselves Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs is one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League in fantasy, half PPR. I think he's the top 5. I think he is number 5. So here's the thing about Stefon Diggs. He's been consistent every single week. Of course, the fact that he's the number 1 wide receiver and John Brown's kind of been disappearing as of late for the Buffalo Bills is a good thing for him. Just this past week against Kansas City, 6 catches, 46 yards, had a nice catch where he dragged his toes near the pylon against Kansas City, scored a touchdown. This upcoming week, they play against the New York Jets. The New York Jets defense, I mean, the entire organization is a mess. Last time we saw Stefon Diggs play against the New York Jets week 1, 8 catches for 86 yards, where Josh Allen was throwing for over 400 passing yards and had himself over 3 passing touchdowns. So again, this seems like another one of these games where they're just going to throw the ball, get back into a rhythm, because of course Josh Allen's been a little bit off kilter for the last couple of weeks. Needs to get back on track, and I think of course feeding the ball to his number 1 wide receiver is the way to do that. Stefon Diggs should be great this week. Number 11, Chris Godwin. Now, I understand Chris Godwin didn't play well this last week after coming back from his injury. And he's dealt with many injuries. Of course, the hamstring's been a problem, but prior to that, it was the concussion. Here's the thing about Chris Godwin. He is one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. He is playing the slot position for the Buccaneers, and he's associated with Tom Brady. Eventually, this is going to be a double-digit target kind of relationship every single week. The fact that they were up so many points and there was such a big point swing against the Green Bay Packers kind of bled out this situation of you're really not going to pass the ball against Green Bay. You don't have to. Run the clock out, run the ball with Rojo. They were getting pretty good yardage on the ground. Mike Evans didn't get involved. Chris Godwin saw very limited participation in the passing game. Only had himself, 5 catches the other day? 5 catches for 48 yards. These aren't the best numbers for Chris Godwin, and something you don't really expect on a weekly basis. You want more. But the thing is, as the weeks progress, he will improve more and more. He'll get more synergy and chemistry with Brady. And of course, playing against Las Vegas Raiders, giving up the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers right now, I think this is just a lock where he's going to get himself a little bit of a bounce back week here and get himself back on track. We have ourselves Amari Cooper at 12 now. Here's the thing about Amari Cooper. 10 targets, 7 receptions, had himself a good amount of yardage, scored a touchdown late in that game, even though it may have been a garbage time touchdown. I'm not really too concerned about it. Yes, the Washington football team, they give up the 3rd fewest points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season, but I'm perfectly fine with that because against number 1 wide receivers, they've given up some pretty good points. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins the other week had himself, a pretty good game against them. So I'm not really too concerned about what Amari Cooper's potential is. I think, sure, there's a potential that CeeDee Lamb or Michael Gallup could steal things here and there, but as long as he's getting consistent targets throughout the game, I still think that Amari Cooper has a lot of value and continue to still be a number 1 wide receiver in the National Football League. Just as long as this offense is having to compete and throw the ball, there's always going to be a chance for Amari Cooper to have a lot of upside going forward, and that's what I expect. We have Terry McLaurin at number 13 on the other side of this matchup. Of course, the Dallas Cowboys, they give up the 2nd most points to opposing wide receivers. I mean, it should be a pretty easy game for Terry McLaurin. Even with Kyle Allen, I'm not kidding, guys. I think Kyle Allen was the right choice in terms of fantasy. Kyle Allen last year was feeding the ball in the direction of DJ Moore, and he's gone about doing that with Terry McLaurin as of the last couple weeks. Just looking at this last week, 12 targets, 7 catches, 74 yards. Double-digit targets is going to be the biggest difference maker. The more opportunity Terry McLaurin gets, the better he's going to be for us in fantasy. And I think this upcoming week, the fact that the Dallas Cowboys already this season have given up 5 100-yard receivers, it just seems like an automatic play, an automatic success for Terry McLaurin. Their secondary sucks, and that organization is kind of falling apart as the weeks go on here. Okay, we have ourselves Will Fuller at number 14. Will Fuller has had 4 consecutive games in a row of scoring a receiving touchdown. This past week, had his season high in terms of targets, 11 targets, 6 receptions for $123 and a touchdown. They play against the Green Bay Packers. Even though Green Bay secondary is a formidable opponent, I still see it as a way of, okay, Green Bay's got themselves some talent in the secondary. There's going to be a little bit of a difficulty there, but let's be honest here. I don't think Houston's going to be able to rely upon the running game enough to where they can just feed the ball to David Johnson and win a game here. They're going to have to pass the ball. Deshaun Watson's going to have to make plays, and he's going to find Brandin Cooks and, of course, Will Fuller, the number 1 wide receiver of the Houston Texans, to make said plays. I think Will Fuller on a consistent weekly basis is an automatic start. He has been that since maybe week 4 after he had a couple big performances here, so just got to keep rolling him out there. Tyler Lockett's my number 15. He's dropped in comparison to where he was a couple weeks back because, of course, touchdowns aren't a guarantee. And if DK Metcalf's the guy scoring touchdowns and Chris Cartonson's getting more utilization down on the goal line and in the red zone, then of course we could see a potential of Tyler Lockett regressing a little bit in the coming weeks. That being said, what kind of Tyler Lockett are we going to see this week? They play against Arizona. This could be a back and forth matchup in which, of course, they have to pass the ball out in order to keep up because their secondary is not at the top, tier level, to say the very least. They're the worst, to be honest. So As of right now, what Tyler Lockett are we going to see? Are we going to see the guy that's getting 8+ targets? Or are we going to see the guy that gets 4 targets and disappears at halftime? That is going to be the biggest determining factor. I expect him to get back on track after the bye week. I'm hoping that Tyler Lockett can stop dropping so many damn passes. Every time I'm watching NFL Red Zone on Sunday, I see the ball hit him in the chest and then hit the floor. It's pissing me off, but hopefully we get himself more targets, more utilization, and we can get a little bit of a comeback from Tyler Lockett here in week 7. Number 16 is Mike Evans. Now, same thing with Mike Evans in correlation to what I'd said about Chris Godwin. I mean, though he didn't perform well, he had 1 catch for 10 yards this past week. They didn't need to use him. They really did not need to use him against the Green Bay Packers. I mean, they had such a significant lead that he didn't even need to play. And him ailing with that ankle injury still, I mean, it was good that they kind of kept him off the field, kept him sidelined, and didn't really have to utilize him. So again, even though that was the case, I think this upcoming week we'll have ourselves a bounce back week here with Mike Evans. Again, throughout from weeks 1 through 5, the guy was scoring a touchdown on a weekly basis, sometimes 2 touchdowns. So again, he'll get back on track. He'll be the red zone threat for this offense. Brady's going to throw it up. He's going to catch a couple here and there. So either way, I think Mike Evans, I have a lot of confidence in. That's why he sits at number 16, because he is one of these top tier wide receivers, and they've got a really good matchup on hand against Las Vegas this week. Move on. We have ourselves Keenan Allen at 17 coming off the bye week. So Keenan Allen, prior to going onto the bye week in week 5, had a little bit of a back injury and left the game against the New Orleans Saints. He probably would have had himself a really good game against them, but unfortunately wasn't given the opportunity. But prior to the New Orleans Saints game in week 5, the 3 weeks prior, he had at least 10 minimum targets every single game. That in itself is so much opportunity that gives me more and more, confidence in the potential of Keenan Allen on a weekly basis being able to just succeed. The Jacksonville Jaguars secondary, not one of the best in the National Football League. I'm not really worried about it at all. The fact that, of course, Austin Eckler is going to be missing more and more time as the weeks progress. The report came out earlier today that he's probably going to miss more time than they actually originally expected. So Keenan Allen's going to be a guy that's obviously the go-to. Mike Williams getting himself involved on the other side of the field could be able to stretch the defense. Hunter Henry. You got yourself a lot of weapons in this offense, but of course, if we get back to Keenan Allen, get into those 10 target marks, we could see him having another great performance here in week 7. Our number 18 for this week is Robby Anderson. Now, here's the thing. Robby Anderson, even though he didn't have the greatest week this past week, was still pretty, okay. 4 catches for 77 yards. It's not going to blow the doors off of anything, but it still was pretty decent in terms of production. Chicago's got a good defense. Teddy Bridgewater was struggling, but that being said, I think they're going to find a lot more success against the New Orleans secondary. They give up some of the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. DJ Moore has always performed well against them, and to be honest, I think any wide receiver duo playing against New Orleans just seems like a field day on a weekly basis. Because again, they've been beat up in the secondary and they're not playing well. They've got a lot of pass interference penalties against them for a reason, because it's just hard for them to cover. Their personnel just isn't at the top tier like it should be. Talking about a couple performances that New Orleans has had dropped on them in the last couple of weeks. Of course, Mike Williams went for 109 and 2 touchdowns a week prior, 62 and 1 against them, and 146 and 1 against them even the week prior to that. So New Orleans has had a lot of great performances dropped on their heads by opposing wide receivers. I think Robby Anderson is on track to do, pretty good, week here in week 7. Moving on, Chase Claypool's my number 19. Again, the Pittsburgh Steelers look like just another level of a team. They're a top contender in the AFC. They take on the Tennessee Titans, another top contender in the AFC. This is going to be an interesting matchup. One team will leave undefeated. The other one will, take a pretty brutal loss. The question on hand is, what exactly can the Tennessee Titans do to stop the passing attack of Ben Roethlisberger and the Steelers? From what I can see, they're probably not going to be able to stop them. I mean, the Tennessee Titans this past week, they gave up 3 touchdowns to Deshaun Watson, 1 to Brandin Cooks, 1 to Will Fuller, and 1 to Randall Cobb. It seemed like the passing game was just an automatic success on a downly basis, and that's what kept Houston in the game, the fact that they were able to dice up that secondary. I always say it, Tennessee's secondary isn't one of the best, and their defense isn't good at all overall, and especially on the ground. I mean, they get burnt a little bit here and there. But the question is, how exactly is, the Pittsburgh Steelers going to approach this? Sure, Chase Claypool this past week, 4 catches, 74 yards, had himself a rushing touchdown. That's 2 weeks in a row with a rushing touchdown. But again, it just seems to me that if Deontay Johnson's not getting more involved, it seems like Chase Claypool is the guy going forward. Sure, we'll see some sprinkles of whether it's James Washington or Juju Smith-Schuster, but I feel like Chase Claypool might be the guy once again this upcoming week against Tennessee's secondary. Allen Robinson's my number 20. Again, he's got a tough matchup. Got to play a former teammate in Jalen Ramsey. That in itself, not an easy task on hand. I think Allen Robinson, of course, is going to be pushed to his limit. And the question is, what exactly are we going to see from him? Sure, if he can get double-digit targets, that's great. But if he's only going to catch 5 passes for 50 yards, just like he did last week, he's kind of going to burn us a little bit. So I think the Rams, they don't give up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers for a reason. Sure, Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel were able to score this past week, but typically that's not the case. So for an offense that, in my opinion, is a lot lesser in the passing department with Nick Foles and Allen Robinson, they'll just be able to double Allen Robinson potentially the entire game and force Nick Foles to throw elsewhere. And that's going to be tough for Robinson, and that's why I have him at number 20. He'll still produce because he's such a great wide receiver. It's just going to be more and more difficult as the day goes on against Ramsey. My number 21 for this week is Bobby Big Plays Robert Woods. So Robert Woods has scored 4 touchdowns this year. That, in my opinion, is what is keeping Robert Woods afloat. Last week, 4 catches, 29 yards, and a touchdown. Seems like that was the only way he was getting to 12 points because 4 catches isn't enough. But a lot of people will forget the fact that he had 10 targets. Those targets were really bad passes. Jared Goff was not on against the 49ers secondary, which again, even though they had Emmanuel Mosley back, was not up to par, respectively. So the way I see it, Robert Woods is a very high upside player, but at some point is going to require a touchdown to be relevant. That's why I've kind of dropped him down here. In the last 2 matchups that Jared Goff has faced against Chicago Bears in 2018 and 2019, he's thrown 5 interceptions and 0 passing touchdowns. That in itself scares me. He's not played well against them in his career. And though this is a different team, this is a different defense, it seems a lot like this Bears defense is one of the top echelon defenses in the National Football League. And Jared Goff is coming off a week where he struggled heavily. And I'm sure the defensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears, Chuck Pagano, he's going to be able to kind of cue in on what exactly the 49ers did to kind of disrupt Jared Goff. I mean, Jared Goff looked like he was scared out there. He looked like Joey Bosa was coming after him. Just wait till Khalil Mack gets after his ass. It's going to be very interesting. We're moving on to DJ Chark. We have ourselves our number 22 wide receiver. Now, DJ Chark this last week, 14 targets, beautiful number. Only 7 catches for 45 yards. This upcoming week plays against the Los Angeles Chargers. He's found success against them in the past. Last year, in 2019, had 9 catches on 10 targets for 75 receiving yards. He's found success against them. That is an automatic. DJ Chark is getting more and more into the rhythm. Of course, he's still battling with injuries. Hopefully, he'll be fully healthy and ready to go this upcoming week. If he's going to get double-digit targets, if Gardner Minshew is going to look in his direction every single down, then it just seems like it's eventually going to, break open the floodgates and he'll have himself a great performance on a weekly basis going forward. I think, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers secondary is a tough one, and that kind of has, DJ Chark kind of sliding on my board personally, but I still think he's got a lot of relevant value going into this upcoming week. Moving on, we have ourselves DJ Moore at 23. Just like I spoke about with, Robby Anderson. Robby Anderson is going to have a good week because the New Orleans secondary is not great. They've given up a lot of big performances, like I mentioned, with Robby Anderson. A lot of 100-yard games, a lot of touchdowns to opposing number 1 wide receivers. The thing is, the last time DJ Moore played against the New Orleans Saints, last year, 9 targets, 6 catches, $126, and 2 receiving touchdowns. So again, he's done himself a pretty good favor or two against his secondary. The interesting thing that I like to see personally, DJ Moore had 11 targets this past week. He had almost double the amount of targets as Robby Anderson. That in itself is leading in a pretty good direction. He had 5 catches for 93 yards. If DJ Moore continues to get more and more targets, he's had himself some success against New Orleans. Could definitely do it once again this upcoming week against them. Travis Fulgham is my number 24 wide receiver. Now, I did hear that there was a little bit of information regarding Deshaun Jackson coming back this week. Not too concerned about it, to be honest. Travis Fulgham has scored a touchdown in 3 consecutive weeks. This past week and the week prior has totaled for 23 total targets. Of course, this last week, 6 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown, but that was against the Baltimore Ravens secondary. We're talking about Marlon Humphreys. We're talking about Marcus Peters. Great cornerbacks in the National Football League. All pro cornerbacks, in fact. So I think to myself, what exactly could we see from Travis Fulgham when he takes on the New York Giants? Automatic success. That's what I'm expecting. With Dallas Goedert out, with Miles Sanders out, with Zach Ertz out, with Alshon Jeffrey potentially out. Sure, you have Deshaun Jackson and Greg Ward, but it's going to go in the direction of Fulgham because he's found that synergy and connection with Wentz, and just seems like should be an automatic play as my number 24. 25, Brandin Cooks. Back-to-back weeks of incredible performances, scoring touchdowns. That's what we want to see. That's what we expected to see. That's why they signed Brandin Cooks. 9 targets, 9 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown. Plays against Green Bay, like I was mentioning with Will Fuller, they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. Sure, Randall Cobb, Kenny Stills, they could take targets and receptions away, but I'm not too worried about the fact because I expect potentially Deshaun Watson to throw the ball upwards of 40 times in this game in order to stay competitive against Aaron Rodgers. So that being the case, Brandin Cooks will have himself a lot of opportunities, can always have one play to take the top off of a defense and score. So that kind of upside just keeps him in this range. He's my number 25 this week. Number 26 is CeeDee Lamb. So even though CeeDee Lamb has been one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League in terms of fantasy football and scoring, with Andy Dalton, he just wasn't the same wide receiver per se. But that had to do a lot with the inaccuracies of Andy Dalton or the offense just not being as efficient on a downly basis to give him more opportunities. Even though that was the case, CeeDee Lamb still had 10 targets, 7 receptions for 64 yards. Playing against Washington, it's one of the tougher matchups, but I still see this offense having a little bit of a bounce back week here and having themselves, be put in the right position. CeeDee Lamb in the slot position, again, like I've always mentioned, Andy Dalton succeeded a lot in the last 2 seasons with Cincinnati by targeting the slot position, targeting Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd was a 1,000-yard receiver there back-to-back seasons with Andy Dalton. So I expect Andy Dalton to get back to at least short dump-off passes. Of course, he was dumping the ball off to Zeke 8 times, or it was 11 targets, but 8 catches. He's going to try to get a little bit of this check down game going, and I expect a lot of those passes to potentially go in the direction of CeeDee Lamb going forward. He sits in my number 26 wide receiver. Our next wide receiver is Jamison Crowder, and he's another one of these slot receivers that is getting consistent targets, and regardless who's at quarterback for the New York Jets, it just seems like he's always getting consistent work. 13 targets this past week, had himself 7 catches for 48 yards. Of course, didn't end up having that upside of a touchdown, but plays against the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills, I've mentioned it before in the past, they have a hard time covering slot wide receivers. Just looking at what Jamison Crowder did against them in week 1. 13 targets, 7 catches, $115 and a touchdown. Obviously, he had a big play for a touchdown, but even with Joe Flacco, whether it's, I'm assuming it's Joe Flacco this week instead of Sam Darnold, it seems like Jamison Crowder is just the number 1 receiving option on this team on a consistent basis. And in a full PPR, half PPR, finds himself innate value just based on that. We move on to Cooper Kupp at 28. So, again, same thing with Robert Woods. I do expect this team to struggle passing the ball because Jared Goff scares me. Cooper Kupp, though he had 9 targets, only had himself, 3 catches for 11 yards. That is not Cooper Kupp. That isn't Cooper Kupp brand football. It just seems like this offense is lost in the last couple of weeks. They just don't know what they're doing in terms of feeding the ball to their best receiving options. They've kind of gotten away from that in my eyes, and I think it's a lot of it has had to do with the fact that Jared Goff has fallen apart. He always does this midway through the season from weeks like 10 through 13, but he's doing it a lot earlier. I'm hoping he doesn't fall apart wholly because, of course, Cooper Kupp needs to find himself value, but I leave him down here because, again, I'm a little concerned. Odell Beckham Jr. is our number 29 wide receiver, so I tried a couple weeks of leaving him out of the number 29 spot, assuming that he was going to play well. He's gone back to his ways of being inconsistent. So we remember a couple weeks back, we put him at number 29. He had himself a 30-point week. We're going to try it again. Even though I think he deserves to be in this range, I think if we put him at number 29, he has himself another great week. Beautiful. We'd love to see it. But again, even against Cincinnati, he's had himself a pretty good game earlier this year in which he caught himself, 4 catches, 74 yards, and a touchdown. I still think that this offense is just kind of hard to trust. They might just run the ball the entire time against Cincinnati and just impose their will that way because Baker's been a little beat up as of late. Darius Slayton's at number 30, playing on Thursday Night Football against the Philadelphia Eagles. Here's the thing. Darius Slayton, he caught 2 passes for 41 yards and a touchdown. On that touchdown catch was a little bit hobbled. Hopefully he's not questionable for the game. I know it's a shorter week. Hopefully he'll be ready to go. He is the number 1 wide receiver. I know Sterling Shepard has been taken off the injured reserve, or he's been given the designation to return from the injured reserve. Maybe he's going to play this week. That kind of opens up their offense a little bit more, helps out Darius Slayton. But either way, he's the number 1 wide receiver for this team. The secondary against Philadelphia hasn't been great. If Daniel Jones can just find a little bit of a spark, Darius Slayton could definitely act upon it and score a touchdown this upcoming week. That's what I'm hoping the case is. We move on to 31, Tyler Boyd, playing against the Cleveland Browns. The last time he played against Cleveland, had himself a pretty good game, a late game touchdown. But regardless, his touchdown count, not something that we rely on. He is more of a catch and yardage kind of guy. 6 catches, 7 catches for 60 or 70 yards every single week. That's his baseline. That's what we're hoping for this upcoming week against Cleveland. Of course, their secondary has been beat up. We've talked about that to an extensive rate over the last couple of weeks. But the question is he going to play second fiddle to T. Higgins and AJ Green once again? I think that won't be the case. I think they'll kind of force the ball towards the middle of the field, force, Mixon to make some plays in the passing game, and Tyler Boyd, and kind of make them pick their poison that way. So I'm expecting Tyler Boyd to have a little bit of a better game than he usually has had over the last couple of weeks. This past week, 5 catches, 54 yards isn't, something that we're losing our mind over, but of course, hopefully can kind of get a bounce back week here against Cleveland. We move ourselves down the line to Deebo Samuel at number 32. Now, he's got to take on probably Gilmore or McCourty, and those aren't the favorable matchups that I want to play wide receivers against. Typically, it's something I want to avoid. That being said, this defense hasn't been what they've been in the past. They've kind of been falling apart. The fact that Tim Patrick can get 100 receiving yards against them kind of gives me hope that Deebo Samuel really does have a chance to put something together here. I mean, he caught all 6 of his targets last week. 6 targets, 6 catches, had himself 66 receiving yards and a touchdown. Of course, that touchdown was a little bit of like a pop forward handoff. But regardless, if in fact this offense is, kind of found their footing and Jimmy Garoppolo is back and better than ever in terms of health, then Deebo Samuel is going to be a guy they continue to utilize and get the ball to. So, of course, while Bill Belichick is shutting down Kittle, the ball's got to go somewhere else. I think it goes in the direction of Deebo. We have ourselves Mike Williams at 33. Of course, he had an incredible week in Week 5 against New Orleans, 109 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, great performance on 5 catches. The question remains, what exactly are we going to see from him going forward? They play against Jacksonville Jaguars. That is a great matchup. From what we've seen from Justin Herbert, he loves to throw the ball deep. He's got an incredibly powerful arm. I mean, even against Tampa Bay, there were a couple guys that on their first catches were going for 70 yards and a touchdown, 60 yards and a touchdown. So there's always a potential that those guys kind of get switched out with Mike Williams. Now that he's healthy and ready to go, he's the deep threat of this offense, spreads the field out, and can take the top off the defense against Jacksonville and score himself a touchdown here. There's always the possibility of that. I mean, don't forget, last year had himself over 1,000 receiving yards. The year prior had himself over 10 receiving touchdowns. So he's still a relevant wide receiver in the National Football League. Moving on to T. Higgins. I think T. Higgins' performance this past week against Indianapolis was a little bit of an eye-opener. 6 catches for $125. That is a pretty good performance against a great defense. He's averaging about 7 targets per week as of thus far this season. Obviously missing week 1, but in the past 5 weeks, 7 targets per game is a pretty good number. So the question is, what are we going to see from T. Higgins? I think if in fact AJ Green's on the other side of the field getting locked up like he was once again, like he did earlier this season on the Thursday night matchup against Cleveland, it's going to have to go in the direction of Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins. That's what I'm kind of subscribing to the idea of. That's why I'm playing T. Higgins this week. Again, if he continues to have these great weeks, has touchdown upside down in the red zone, just seems like automatic success to me. Juju Smith-Schuster is my number 35. He's going to have to prove it to me. He's been below par, to say the very least. He's just hasn't been clicking. The offense has been running the ball well. They've been getting the ball to Chase Claypool on a consistent basis. James Washington stepped up. Even with Deontay Johnson out, Juju Smith-Schuster has not been able to find himself success. Only had 2 catches on 4 targets for 6 yards this last week. You got to prove it to me, bud. Otherwise, I have a hard time 100% playing you. Christian Kirk's my last option here. We have ourselves Christian Kirk because, again, even though he caught the ball twice for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns, there's always the potential of volatility. There's always a potential that Andy Isabella or Larry Fitzgerald or somehow Dan Arnold scores or Chase Edmonds scores on a touchdown instead of Christian Kirk. I know the Seattle secondary is god-awful, and I'm hoping Christian Kirk takes advantage of said matchup, but we just got to be careful. Unless the target opportunity for Christian Kirk ends up getting to the 7 or 8 number, I'm afraid of it because there's always the volatility of him not making that big play, the ball being overthrown, a pass interference call being made, and he just is kind of dwindled out of the entire opportunity of the offense. But those are my thought process. Those are my opinions going into Week 7. Again, rankings are subject to change. You can meet us up on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be talking about updated rankings, all that kind of jazz. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Make sure you leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Tomorrow, we're talking quarterbacks and tight ends before Thursday night's matchup between the Philadelphia Eagles and New York Giants. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.